As those defenses are already prepared, a relieving force arriving later finds it easier, especially if the enemy is close, simply to occupy the old positions and make only minor adjustments. That is particularly true if the positions embrace some terrain feature that higher command insists must be retained in the same strength with which it had been held before, such as the Schnee-Eifel. When the 2D Division took over in the vicinity of St.Vith in early October, it assumed responsibility from the two divisions it relieved of two salients into the west wall, one atop the densely forested, often fog-enshrouded Schnee-Eifel, the other some 7 miles to the southwest, near the village of Grosskampenberg. The salient near Grosskampenberg was on open ground, dominated by pillboxes on higher ground still held by the Germans, so exposed that movement to or within the positions by daylight was impossible, and even in a sector where both sides were inclined to live and let live, the Germans were nervous lest the Americans exploit that partial penetration of the west wall. They threw in frequent mortar and artillery concentrations and probed the positions with strong patrols. After tolerating the situation for almost a month, the division commander, General Robertson, convinced his corps commander, General Middleton, to allow him to blow up the captured pillboxes and retire to positions prepared in advance a few miles to the rear. Having accomplished that at the start of November, the division's southernmost regiment from that point held a well-prepared, although elongated line in the vicinity of Grosskampenberg and a village a little to the north, Heckerscheid. Yet despite those adjustments, the regiment's line still reflected something of the original dispositions. The new positions covered two relatively minor roads leading west, while on the regiment's north wing, a major road leading to the crossing of the Our River at Steinebruck and on to St.vith was the responsibility of what could only be described as an outpost. Astride that road at the hamlet of Eigelscheid stood 130 men of the regiment's cannon company, operating not in their normal role as infantry fire support with towed, short-nosed 105 mm howitzers, but as infantrymen. The outpost at Eigelscheid was all the more vulnerable because to the north, the main positions of the next regiment, atop the Schnee-Eifel, were almost 4 miles away. In between were to be found only the division's reconnaissance troop 50 men and an attached troop of the 18th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, 145 men. In addition, at the village of Blyalf, guarding the south flank of the positions on the Schnee-Eifel, was a provisional meaning makeshift battalion composed of an anti-tank company, a platoon of a cannon company operating as infantry, a rifle platoon, and an I&R platoon. The grand total came to about 350 men. The principal points of entry into what was to become the 106th Division sector, all of which funneled into St.Vith, were thus barred in less strength than any other part of the overextended line, the cavalry in the Losheim Gap defending the route around the north of the Schnee-Eifel, the makeshift battalion at Blyalf astride the principal route around the south end of the high ridge, and a cannon company fighting as infantry astride the road leading to the Our at Steinebruck. In rear of the two regiments on the Schnee-Eifel, the road net afforded an enemy coming around either or both ends of the ridgeline an opportunity for not one, but two envelopments. From the village of AUW in the Losheim Gap, there was the road running south along a relatively high ridgeline to Blyalf Skyline Boulevard, thus affording a route for a shallow envelopment. From Andler in the Losheim Gap, there was the road following the trace of the Our River to link with a road from Blyalf at Schönberg, thus affording a route for a deeper envelopment. The only major road leading to St.Vith ran through Schönberg, and the entire division, including all of its artillery battalions, had a river at its back. Atop the Schnee-Eifel, the defensive positions were well prepared, the product of 2 months' work by the men of the 2D Division. Almost all foxholes had log cover, and the troops had dry sleeping quarters either in pillboxes or in squad huts constructed from logs. Yet that was about all that could be said for the positions, except that they were on dominating ground. Even that advantage was largely negated by a dense coniferous forest covering the entire ridge, which sharply limited both observation and fields of fire. As with the salient in the west wall near Grosskampenberg, the commander of the 2D Division, General Robertson, was unhappy with the salient on the Schnee-Eifel, and early in November he had asked permission to withdraw the two regiments to the open ridgeline, carrying the AUW Blyalf Road, Skyline Boulevard. His corps commander, General Middleton agreed, but neither General Hodges nor General Bradley would approve on the grounds that the positions on the Schnee-Eifel represented a penetration of the West Wall that might later be exploited in any general advance toward the Rhine. Neither of those commanders, nor any of their senior staff officers, chose to have a first-hand look at the ground. Despite their denial, Robertson made up his mind that should the two regiments on the Schnee-Eifel be threatened with envelopment, he would pull them back to Skyline Boulevard. Yet the fact that Robertson was planning to move to Skyline Boulevard, which would still be subject to envelopment, rather than behind the Aar River, was an indication that he was not thinking in terms of any major enemy offensive, and he made no effort to construct alternate positions, nor did the 2D Division prepare a plan of withdrawal. The division did prepare a counterattack plan based on the possibility of a limited enemy thrust around one end or the other of the Schnee-Eifel. In that event, Robertson intended to employ an infantry battalion that he held in reserve well to the rear at the village of Born, just north of St.Vith, and possibly a second infantry battalion held in reserve near Steinebruck, plus an attached medium tank battalion, the Division Engineer Battalion, and attached anti-aircraft half-tracks. That force appeared to be adequate for any contingency, for as the letter of instructions outlining the plan put it, a major offensive in this sector is not probable. That there was nevertheless concern about the whole area, including the Losheim Gap, was reflected in General Middleton's placing the bulk of his corps artillery in positions from which to fire into some part of the sector. 7 of those battalions were brigaded under headquarters of 3 artillery groups, while the 8th, the 275th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, was attached to the 106th Division for support of the 14th Cavalry Group. Forward observers from all the battalions maintained observation posts in the line and all charted pre-arranged concentrations on points of likely trouble. The 275th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, for example, registered 200 concentrations that might be called for by number within the Losheim Gap. The 8 battalions represented a powerful reinforcement. On the other hand, the firing positions of 3 of them were east of the Aar River, behind the Schnee-Eifel, and thus shared one of the weaknesses inherent in the 106th Division's positions a river at their back. If the enemy should achieve a major penetration, support from the corps artillery battalions would be short-lived, for few commanders would risk the loss of big corps guns, not only 105 mm howitzers, but also 155 mm, and 8-inch guns and howitzers. Despite the support inherent in the presence of the corps artillery, the defensive positions inherited by the 106th Division, and particularly the positions of the 2 regiments on the Schnee-Eifel, were an invitation to disaster, the only possible rationalization being that nothing ever happened in the Ardennes. Small wonder that General Jones and his regimental commanders were upset. Yet there was little they could do about it, for in order to conceal and facilitate the 2D Division's relief and movement to the attack on the Roa River dams, the relief had to be accomplished man for man, gun for gun, with the 2D Division leaving its heavier weapons in place in exchange for those of the 106th Division. Like many divisions that had failed to get overseas before American battlefield casualties began to mount, the 106th had undergone several levies on its trained troops. During the year of 1944, the division had to relinquish more than 7,000 men, representing 60% of enlisted strength. In their place, arriving only a short time before the division embarked for shipment overseas, were 1,200 men from the ASTP, 1,100 from training as air cadets, 1,500 from other divisions not yet scheduled for overseas, and 2,500 from various disbanded small units, mostly service troops. That the 106th Division was not the only division to go through that debilitating process afforded scant comfort. Like most veteran divisions in Europe, the 2D Division by that time had accumulated weapons well in excess of normal issue, particularly machine guns, and when men of the 106th Division had no machine gun to exchange, the men of the 2D Division took their extra weapons with them. Although the 2D Division left its extensive telephone lines intact, a line ran to almost every squad. Those were of little use to incoming troops who lacked the large numbers of sound-powered telephones that over the months the 2D Division had seized from the Germans. Unlike the 2D Division, the 106th Division had no attached tank battalion, and its attached tank destroyers were not self-propelled, but towed. The lack of tanks in particular was a serious, even crippling disadvantage. Division headquarters was set up in a former hospital, St. Joseph's Cloister, run by a Catholic order in St.vith. The Germans had used it as a hospital, but the 2D Division later put a tarpaulin over the large red cross on the roof. There, General Robertson and his staff briefed General Jones and his. At Robertson's order, an officer was to remain behind at each battalion and regimental headquarters, and a senior non-commissioned officer with each company to spend the first night with the new units. For a division that was to jump off in the attack the morning after its last regiment was relieved from its defensive positions, that was about all that men and commanders of the 2D Division could be expected to do for the newcomers, except to tell the men for God's sake take off those neckties, and in at least one case, to assure a worried soldier, no, you do not stand guard at right shoulder arms, and to tell each and all how lucky they were. It was a quiet sector, a little mortar and artillery fire, an occasional patrol, but that was all. A piece of cake. For men thus assured, the artillery barrage that began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th was a jolting experience, even though the artillery available to the German 66th Corps was considerably less than elsewhere along the front. Atop the Schnee-Eifel, the shells ripped into the big fir trees, sending branches crashing to the forest floor, but since the positions were sturdy and covered with logs, few casualties resulted. At the same time, heavy shelling hit the villages behind the ridgeline, particularly Schlausenbach and Boucher, sites of the command posts of the two regiments on the Schnee-Eifel. Shelling was also heavy on the two villages barring major roads, Bleialf and Eigelscheid. It was heavy too on road junctions in the rear, including Schönberg and St.vith, which took a pounding from big railway guns. Telephone lines at the front went out early, including those to supporting artillery battalions, and the units of the 106th Division had had little experience using radios. As in the Losheim Gap, nowhere along the entire extended line of the 106th Division did the Germans take advantage of the artillery preparation to close quickly with the defenders. On the Schnee-Eifel, that was by design. All that the 18th Volksgrenadier Division planned there were a few thrusts during the course of the day by strong patrols, to conceal the fact that in order to free troops for the pincer movements north and south, nothing more than the division's field replacement battalion of 200 men had been left to face the Schnee-Eifel. Although General von Manteuffel had considered that the Americans might respond to his attack by driving down the eastern slopes of the Schnee-Eifel to cut off his spearheads, he concluded in the end that an inexperienced division would hardly react that way. Men of the 422D and 423D regiments on the Schnee-Eifel handily repulsed such patrols as tried to climb the steep slope, and when the day came to an end, they considered that they had done their job well. The 2D Division troops had warned them that when a new division entered the line, the Germans would react with strong patrols, and that was what they thought had happened. At Bleialf, there was no such misplaced confidence for a half hour after the artillery fire lifted. A battalion of Volksgrenadiers struck the village. The impetus of that thrust threw back the bulk of the provisional battalion, while other Germans advancing up a railway cut at the southern edge of the village severed contact with the attached troop of the 18th Cavalry. Telephoning General Jones in St.vith, the commander of the 423D Infantry, Col Charles C. Cavender, asked for return of his 2D battalion, which had been held at Born as the mainstay of the division reserve. Jones refused. It was too early in the fight to part with half his little reserve. Left with no other choice, Cavender assembled a makeshift counter-attacking force built around his service company, a company of the 81st Engineer Battalion, every man who could be spared from Headquarters Company, and the remainder of Cannon Company, all fighting as infantry. With help from supporting artillery and a brace of towed 3-inch guns from the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion, emplaced on a hill overlooking Bleialf, that conglomerate force penetrated the village and in house-to-house fighting retook all the houses except for a few on lower ground near the railroad. A few hundred yards to the south, against the men of Troop B, 18th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, the German attack began in earnest just as it was getting light. By mid-morning, with the help of supporting artillery, The cavalrymen had the situation in hand, but were running low on ammunition. 4 men in an armoured car commanded by Sergeant Wade H. Bankston managed to work forward from troop headquarters in Winterscheid, 1,000 yards to the rear, and distribute a resupply of ammunition just before the Germans struck again. But when ammunition began to run low a second time, German fire made it impossible to get forward with more. By radio, the troop commander, Captain Robert G. Fosland, reported his situation to Colonel Cavender, to whose regiment the cavalrymen were attached. In a rare display of concern for an impossible situation, Cavender responded, "If you cannot hold, you may withdraw." Under covering fire from 3 armoured cars, all 3 cavalry platoons fell back, bringing their wounded and their equipment with them. Reaching Winterscheid, they began preparing an all-around defence of the village, out of contact with men of the 424th Infantry in Bleilf, and those of the division's reconnaissance troop to the southeast in the village of Grosslangenfeld. As troopers began to drift into Winterscheid, the cavalrymen soon learned that the 106th Reconnaissance Troop, little larger than a platoon, had gone to pieces under the first impact of the enemy attack. In the sector of the 424th Infantry to the southwest, the 62D Volksgrenadier Division attacked with 2 regiments abreast, with the main effort directed at Eigelscheid and the road to Steinebruck, while a supporting attack not quite 2 miles to the south, aimed at high ground, marked astride its crest by the village of Heckuscheid. It was at Heckuscheid that the first Germans appeared, just as a misty dawn was beginning to break. The positions of the 3D Battalion at Heckuscheid had the shape of an inverted L, with Company L holding a cluster of houses on a hillock at the angle, and other positions on a reverse slope extending to the north, while Company K extended the line from the cluster of houses into Heckuscheid. The Germans quickly seized the cluster of houses, from which they were able to provide supporting fire for an assault against the rest of Company L position. The assault forced the men of Company L back to the next ridgeline, where they held until the battalion's reserve company counterattacked and restored the position. Among some 200 German prisoners were a battalion commander and his reconnaissance officer. Subjected to heavy fire from Nebelwerfers, Company K in Heckuscheid nevertheless repulsed several attacks, and in the process captured a wounded German officer. On his person, the company commander, Captain Richard J. Comer, found a map case containing a document that looked to be of considerable importance. It was an order from the G3 of the 46th Corps subject, undertaking Grafe, and it told of Germans operating in American uniforms, explaining how they were to identify themselves to other Germans. Comer rushed it to the rear. By early afternoon, it was in the hands of the Division G2, Colonel Stout. A few hundred yards south of Heckuscheid, near Grosskampenberg, a misty day had fully dawned when the first Germans struck the 424th Infantry's other forward battalion. Those Germans were from the 116th Panzer Division, spilling over from that division's thrust against a neighbouring regiment of the 28th Division. The Germans passed diagonally across the front of the battalion's flank, which enabled the men on that flank to exact a heavy toll. Because the German objectives appeared to be a road leading from Lutzkampen, in the 28th Division sector, into the rear of the 424th Infantry, and a bridge over the Our at the village of Burg Reuland, the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Umanoff, covered his open flank by positioning his reserve company astride the road. Hardly had that company moved into position when 5 Mark IV tanks appeared. Small arms fire forced the tank commanders to close their turrets. A 57 mm anti-tank gun knocked out one, and PVT. Gilbert E. Thomas stopped another with a bazooka. When the other 3 fell back, that ended the threat to the 424th Infantry's right flank. Meanwhile, the critical spot for the 424th Infantry was at Eigelscheid, on the road to Steinebruck, where the commander of the 62D Volksgrenadier Division, Col Frederick Kittel, was hoping for a swift penetration, whereupon he intended to commit a battalion on bicycles to seize St.Vith in a coup de main, and there, he hoped, capture trains loaded with gasoline. As Kittel soon learned, it was a plan far too ambitious for the inexperienced troops involved. Even had it succeeded, they would have found no gasoline stocks in St.Vith, for the closest American railhead to the town was 10 miles away. Soon after daylight, the little band of defenders in Eigelscheid, saw a mass of Germans in a long skirmish line on the skyline at a road junction a few hundred yards to the front. To the American soldiers, the inexperience of the German troops seemed apparent, for they stood erect, advanced in bunches, and fired their weapons wildly without regard for specific targets. They also appeared to be either drunk or doped, and the men of Cannon Company could hear their leaders swearing and shouting, "Marschiert schnell, schnell, move quickly, quickly." The commander of Cannon Company, Captain Joseph Friesland, called for round after round of artillery fire from the supporting 591st Field Artillery Battalion. With each concentration, the German line would waver, but amid shouting and blowing of whistles, the men reformed and continued forward. One man with a bugle exhorted the troops with bugle calls until American fire cut him down. Fire from 4 heavy .30 caliber and 3.50 caliber machine guns the men had borrowed from the regiment's reserve battalion strongly augmented the fire of the company's carbines and M1S. Early in the fighting, Captain Friesland raced by jeep to the regimental headquarters in a village to the rear to ask for help from the reserve battalion located near Steinebruck, only to learn that since General Jones had designated that battalion as part of the division reserve, the commander of the 424th Infantry, Col. Alexander D. Reed, could release it only with Jones' approval. As with Colonel Cavender of the 423d Infantry, the answer was no. By the time Friesland got back to his company, the situation had markedly deteriorated. With the collapse of the 106th Reconnaissance Troop at Grosslangenfeld, just over a mile to the north, another German force was advancing on Eigelscheid from that direction, and along the main road appeared 4 self-propelled 75 mm assault guns. Again, Friesland rushed back to the regimental headquarters. That time, Colonel Reed told him that the assistant division commander, Brig General Herbert T. Perrin, had arrived at Winterspelt, the first village behind Eigelscheid. Perhaps Perrin could prevail upon General Jones to release the reserve battalion. When Perrin heard Friesland's story, he took it on his own to call forward a rifle company from the Reserve Company C, which despite German shelling was soon on the march to join Cannon Company in Eigelscheid. Not long before noon, Perrin gained Jones' approval to move up the rest of the battalion, but by the time those companies got to Winterspelt, the defences of Eigelscheid were about to collapse, and Winterspelt itself was under attack from German troops moving up a dirt track from Grosslangenfeld. At Eigelscheid, the commander of a detachment of 57 mm anti-tank guns, Staff Sergeant Rocco P. De Felice, although wounded, brought the fire of one of his guns to bear on the 4 German assault guns. He knocked out 2 before fire from one of the others demolished his frail piece. By that time, the Volksgrenadiers, by sheer weight of numbers, were beginning to break into the houses. When Captain Friesland ordered one of his platoons on the southern fringe of the village to fall back, the platoon leader, 2D Lieutenant Crawford Wheeler, told his men to obey, but he himself refused to budge. "Somebody's got to stay here and do the job," he shouted. The last anybody saw of Wheeler, one of the assault guns was firing point blank into his position. In the end, there was no holding Eigelscheid. Early that afternoon, in a sudden snow squall, the survivors of Cannon Company made a fighting withdrawal, along with the men of Company C, back to Winterspelt to join the rest of the 1st Battalion, augmented by a company of the 81st Engineer Battalion. There the men prepared to stand, just 2 miles by way of a winding, rapidly descending road in front of the important bridge over the Auer River at Steinebruck. Except at Eigelscheid, the 424th Infantry's defences were intact, and the enemy's ambitious plan for a swift thrust to St.Vith thwarted, but the augury for the morrow was less than good. The 591st Field Artillery Battalion had fired over 2,600 rounds, which was about all the artillerymen had on hand, and soon after nightfall, astride the road to Steinebruck, troops of the 62d Volksgrenadier Division renewed their attack, striking hard at Winterspelt. A crisis was thus developing close to the south flank of the 106th Division. Yet it had nowhere near such perilous connotations for the survival of the division as the crisis that had evolved on the north flank with the withdrawal of the 14th Cavalry Group. There, the command post of the 424th Infantry at Schlausenbach, the regiment's direct support Field Artillery Battalion, and the division's general support 155 mm Howitzer Battalion all were in immediate peril, and unless the northern pincer of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division could be blunted, both regiments on the Schnee-Eifel soon might be trapped. Only recently promoted to the rank of colonel at age 32, George L. DESCHENEAUX Jr. was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the United States Army. With the start of the enemy's artillery preparation early on December 16th, DESCHENEAUX awoke in the house where he was billeted and hurried next door to his command post in the village's tiny gasthouse beside a little stream running through the valley. So, thought DESCHENEAUX, that ethnic Pole the men of Company E had captured the day before had not been nuts. He had said the Germans were going to attack before Christmas, and from the weight of shells falling on Schlausenbach, he knew what he was talking about. By 8:30 a.m., there were reports of Germans infiltrating up a wooded draw between Kobscheid and AUW in the direction of Schlausenbach, then another report of 50 Germans in white camouflage suits on high ground between Schlausenbach and AUW. Patrols dispatched from the Regimental Reserve, Company L, soon returned with 2 defiant prisoners. In addition to the command post, DESCHENEAUX was concerned about his supporting artillery, for both his own direct support battalion, the 589th, and the general support howitzers of the 592D were emplaced a mile or so from Schlausenbach, along either side of Skyline Boulevard, near the hamlet of Laudesfeld. They thus were vulnerable to any German push down the road from Au. When the company of the 81st Engineer Battalion at AUW folded in mid-morning, it was obvious that those artillery battalions would soon be under attack, unless DESCHENEAUX could do something about it. Employing his reserve, Company L, as a nucleus, DESCHENEAUX added portions of his anti-tank and cannon companies, fighting as infantry but supported by cannon companies' howitzers, and ordered the force to retake AUW and block access to Skyline Boulevard. Even as the men were assembling, 3 German assault guns began to push south from AUW along the little road inappropriately christened a boulevard. From a previously prepared outpost along the road, a bazooka team hit the first gun, and a howitzer from Battery A, 589th Field Artillery Battalion, also hit it with a round of direct fire, setting the gun on fire. The other 2 assault guns fell back along the road to a point where the lay of the land hid them from view. The action produced momentary relief for the men and howitzers of the 589th Field Artillery Battalion, but there was ample evidence that German patrols were operating in woods near the firing positions, and an enemy force blocked the only exit little better than a logging road for Battery C pieces. As nightfall approached, the howitzers were in obvious peril, and the general support 155 mmR pieces soon might be no better off. Colonel DESCHENEAUX's little counterattack, which began around 2 p.m., even as the artillerymen first engaged the assault guns, was making some progress when DESCHENEAUX had to call it off. Because Germans were pressing up the wooded draw leading to Schlausenbach, he was forced to establish a defensive line to protect his headquarters. That left nobody to block for the artillery. Early on the morning of December 16th, General Jones ordered half his division reserve, the 2D Battalion, 423D Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph P. Pewitt, the battalion that was located at Bourne, and whose services Jones had denied the commander of the 423D Infantry, to move by truck to St.Vith and await instructions. As Pewitt waited in the division headquarters, Jones and his staff were discussing, sometimes heatedly, whether to pull the 2 regiments off the Schnee-Eifel and back to Skyline Boulevard. At one point, Jones telephoned the corps commander to raise the issue. General Middleton was to say later that he was concerned that if the 2 inexperienced regiments began to withdraw, they might go halfway to Paris. Jones decided finally to leave the regiments in place. Shortly after midday, General Jones told Colonel Pewitt to proceed to Schönberg and sent a radio truck with him so that Pewitt could report what he found when he got there. At the village, Pewitt saw vehicles from the 14th Cavalry Group streaming through, but the word was that a troop of cavalry was still at Andler, thus blocking the road that led down the valley of the Our to Schönberg. Reporting all that to Jones, Pewitt told him also that he had heard from the 589th Field Artillery Battalion, which needed help. Well after nightfall, around 7:30 p.m., Jones radioed Pewitt to go to Skyline Boulevard and help the 589th and 592D Field Artillery Battalions to displace. Having by that time released his other reserve infantry battalion for commitment at Winterspelt, Jones wanted to maintain some flexibility with Puett's battalion and told Puett not to get heavily engaged. Yet by denying Puett mobility, Jones virtually ensured that that would happen. Once Puett reached the artillery battalions, he was to release his trucks for return to the rear. As commander of a reserve battalion, Colonel Puett had made a point of reconnoitering as many roads as possible in the division's sector, and in the process had discovered the existence of a corduroy road leading up a steep incline through a fir forest. Known as the Engineer Cutoff, it had been constructed by engineers of the 2D Division to bypass the junction of Skyline Boulevard with the Schoenberg-Blyalf Road, which was under enemy observation and frequently shelled. Calling in a platoon leader, 2D Lount Oliver B. Patton, Puett told him to go by jeep by way of the Engineer Cutoff to Skyline Boulevard, locate the artillery battalions, and return to guide Puett's battalion forward. With a driver and 2 other men, Patton reached the Engineer Cutoff, but as the jeep bounced over the logs in the darkness, Patton heard what sounded like tanks approaching and shouts in German. Patton ordered his driver to turn the jeep off the road as if it were wrecked, and everybody hid in the woods while what appeared to be several tanks drove by with German infantry accompanying them. Once the Germans had passed, the men pulled the jeep from the ditch, pushed it to get it started again, and continued on their way. Locating the positions of the 589th Field Artillery Battalion, they picked up a guide to ensure that they would find their way back again and returned without difficulty to Schoenberg. The German vehicles and soldiers Patton and his men encountered on the Engineer Cutoff apparently constituted a patrol and may have subsequently established a roadblock at 88 Corner. By midnight, Puett's battalion had reached the artillery positions, where Puett found that Jonas' order not to get heavily engaged was like telling a man to take a swim but not get very wet. Early in the evening, from his command post at the Gasthaus in Schlausenbach, George Deschenaux asked General Jones for authority to pull back his northernmost battalion from the Schnee-Eifel to form a new line blocking to the north between the Schnee-Eifel and Schlausenbach. Not until a little after 11 p.m. did Jones grant that authority, so that it was midnight before the battalion began to move. By that time, Colonel Puett's battalion had arrived. Soon a line was forming, consisting of 2 battalions and Company L, and extending from the Schnee-Eifel past Schlausenbach and across Skyline Boulevard. That line, thin as it was, conceivably might block envelopment of the Schnee-Eifel from the north along the road from Kobscheid to Schlausenbach, or along Skyline Boulevard, the shallow envelopment, but along the principal approach to Schoenberg from the north, the road following the trace of the Our, and the possible route for a deeper envelopment, the only defenders were the 100 or so men of Troop B, 32D Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, at Andler. If that little force collapsed, or if the conglomerate force that had retaken Blyalf at the other end of the Schnee-Eifel should fold, the way to Schoenberg and its critical bridge over the Our River would be open. And once the Germans got to Schoenberg, anybody and anything still on the east bank of the Our River would be trapped. While attending the University of Washington, Alan Walter Jones earned a commission as a second lieutenant of infantry through the ROTC and entered the army in 1917. He elected to stay on after the Great War, and between wars went through all the appropriate service schools. He had commanded the 106th Infantry Division since the division's formation in the spring of 1943. A stockily built man with full, rounded face, jet black hair, heavy eyebrows, and a thin moustache, Jones had just turned 50 when he brought his Golden Lions into the line. Outwardly calm, he was a person who seldom revealed his emotions. Yet because he was sharply conscious that he had never been responsible before for men's lives in combat, the ill-chosen, overextended positions he had inherited troubled him far more than they had apparently disturbed General Robertson. Jones also had an intense personal concern. His only son, First Lieutenant Alan W. Jones, Jr., was on the staff of one of Colonel Cavender's battalions, and Alan's wife, Lynn, back in Washington, D.C., was pregnant with her first child. Almost from the start of the German artillery preparation on December 16th, General Jones was convinced that what was hitting his division was something big. What else could explain the reports from the 28th Division to the south and the 99th Division to the north of similar heavy barrages? Yet for a long time, Jones did little in reaction to the crisis. Having denied one of his 2 reserve infantry battalions to Colonel Cavender for use at Bleelf, it was almost noon before he authorized the battalion near Steinebnick to move to Eigelscheid and Winterspelt, and after midday before he sent Colonel Pewett's battalion to Schönberg. The last 2 decisions may both have been made easier by the fact that at 11:20 a.m., the Corps commander, General Middleton, attached to the 106th Division a battalion of Corps engineers, the 168th, a part of which was soon in St.Vith, so that even after committing 2 infantry battalions, Jones still had a small reserve. In the meantime, Jones had denied Colonel Devine's plea for help in the Losheim Gap, for what had he to send? Around midday, the commander of the First Army, General Hodges, at Middleton's request, released to the 8th Corps the 9th Armoured Division's Combat Command B, which had only recently left the Corps to serve as a reserve in the attack on the Roa River dams. Since the Combat Command was in an assembly area 12 miles north of St.Vith, near the village of Faymonville, and was already on 1-hour alert for possible commitment in support of the attack on the dams, its men and armoured vehicles could have been in St.Vith in less than 2 hours, but General Middleton wanted to learn more of the enemy situation before committing what constituted one of only 2 armoured combat commands available to him as reserves. Although he attached the 9th Armoured Division's CCB to the 106th Division, it was to remain in its assembly area and be committed only with Middleton's approval. Darkness was approaching when the Combat Command's liaison officer, First Lieutenant Raymond L. Lewis, arrived back from a mission to the 2D Division to find the headquarters in a schoolhouse on the edge of Faymonville-Astur, with the news of the attachment. He left promptly to travel the few miles to the village of Ligneuville, where his commander, Brig General William H. Hogue, was enjoying an early dinner with a friend, Brig. General Edward W. Timberlake, commander of the 49th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Brigade, in one of the more charming old inns in the Ardennes, the Hôtel du Moulin, long renowned for its cuisine. Grimy from a day on the road, young Lewis reluctantly interrupted the dinner to tell General Hogue that General Middleton wanted him to telephone. As Hogue left to make the call, General Timberlake invited Lewis to sit down and eat. As far as Lewis was concerned, the hotel was still renowned for its cuisine, for the chef had done things with US Army ground beef that Lewis had never known a mess sergeant to do. After putting CCB on a 10-minute alert, General Hogue left at 6 p.m. for St.Vith, arriving at General Jones' headquarters in the St. Joseph's Cloister a half-hour later. On the ground floor it was pandemonium, non-commissioned officers and clerks running about, junior officers arguing in loud voices. Going upstairs, he found Jones in his office, remarkably composed. Jones wanted Hogue to move his combat command into the Losheim Gap at Manderfeld, arriving there at dawn the next day to counterattack and erase the enemy penetration threatening the positions on the Schnee Eifel. In the meantime, Jones wanted a platoon of self-propelled tank destroyers at St.Vith immediately to protect his headquarters. Hardly had Hogue left the headquarters than Jones received a telephone call from General Middleton. He was sending more help, said Middleton. A combat command of the 7th Armoured Division was to arrive at St.Vith at 7 a.m. the next morning, December 17, and the entire division was to follow. With Jones, when he received that news, was the Assistant G2 of the A8th Corps, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Sladen, whom Middleton had sent to the 106th Division as an advisor until the division could become acclimated. Sladen knew that the 7th Armoured Division was at least 60 miles away in the Netherlands. Whereas the head of the ponderous column might conceivably reach St.Vith by 7 o'clock the next morning, it would be long hours before an entire combat command could arrive, and longer than that before the combat command would be ready to attack. Yet Sladen kept his views to himself. Both Middleton and Jones had attended more service schools and studied far more logistical tables than he had. Who was he, a lieutenant colonel, to say that his corps commander, a major general, was, at best, abysmally misinformed? When Jones heard the news that he was soon to get a second combat command of armour, and, in time, an entire armoured division, he felt as if somebody had removed a sack of lead from his back. Although he recognised that the principal crisis he faced involved the 2 regiments on the Schnee Eifel, he was also seriously concerned about the Germans at Winterspelt, who were apparently bearing down on the crossing of the Our River at Steinebruck. Yet at that point, he had the means to deal with both. It would be better, he decided, to use the 9th Armoured Division's CCB at Winterspelt, thereby freeing the narrow streets of St.Vith of that combat command's host of tanks and other vehicles. That in turn would allow unfettered passage of the combat command of the 7th Armoured Division through St.Vith and out on the road to Schönberg to the relief of the troops on the Schnee-Eifel. At the schoolhouse in Fehmarnville, General Hogue was about to end his briefing of his commanders for the move to the Losheim Gap and Manderfeld, when a call came through from St.Vith, informing him of Jones's change of plan. The greater distance involved, Hogue decided, dictated that his command get on the road immediately. His subordinate commanders hastened back to their units to pass the word along. As the evening wore on in the St. Joseph's Cloister, Alan Jones, for all his relief over the morrow's promised help, began to question his decision to leave the 2 regiments up on the Schnee-Eifel. At some time late in the evening, he decided to propose withdrawal. He soon had the corps commander on the telephone for a conversation that was destined to have a major impact on the outcome of the battle in front of St.Vith. Ralph G. Hill Jr. was a captain in command of a detachment of 3 other officers and 5 enlisted men detailed to serve once the U.S. Army entered Germany as a military government for a Wehrkreis. Hill and his detachment had arrived in eastern Belgium in September, at a time when it appeared that American troops were about to penetrate well beyond the German frontier. When the drive ended atop the Schnee-Eifel, he and his detachment assumed responsibility for handling relations with Belgian civilians in and just north of the Losheim Gap. On the order of the commander of the 1st Division to occupy defensive positions north of the Gap, Hill evacuated some 10,000 civilians from the region, leaving behind only some 400 inmates and attendants of an asylum for geriatric patients in the division headquarters town of Butgenbach, and around 200 farmers who were to care for the beets. When the 99th Division assumed responsibility for the area in November, the division commander, Major and General Walter E. Lauer, found the lowing of the cattle upsetting 200 men were unable to keep them all milked on schedule, and ordered Hill to get rid of them. Since driving the animals westward would tie up military traffic for days, the only solution appeared to be slaughter. Hill had the Belgian farmers set up 12 butchering stations, and when American supply trucks had delivered their loads in Butgenbach, the Belgians reloaded the empty trucks with meat, which the drivers delivered to towns and cities to the rear. There, the civilian authorities, if notified in advance, would be happy to provide men to unload it. Yet in order to notify the civilian authorities, Hill needed a reliable communications system. Carrying a flashlight and a field telephone, he went across the street from the house where he was billeted in the town of Bullingen and descended the stairs into the cellar of the post office. There he found an underground telephone cable and a long row of terminal points. Connecting his field telephone to each in turn, he finally got a response: Bonn higher. He had reached a female operator in the German city of Bonn, alongside the Rhine. When the woman learned she was talking to an American soldier in Bullingen, she thought it hilarious. Where did her switchboard indicate his call was originating from? Hill asked. When she said Spa, Hill disconnected her, and as soon as possible sent a man to Spa. Once the man located the terminus of the cable and convinced civilian authorities to run a line to headquarters of the First Army in the Hotel Britannique, Hill had the communications network he needed. To make it more comprehensive, he arranged for lines to be run to headquarters of the 99th Division in Butgenbach and to headquarters of the 2D Division in St.Vith. On December 16th, Ralph Hill faced another day of supervising the butchering of cattle and arranging for receiving and shipping the meat. When he tried to place a telephone call to Eupen through the 99th Division switchboard, the operator told him the line was out, cut by paratroopers. Talking to the signal officer, he learned that the line had gone out before daylight, that the officer had sent out a troubleshooting crew that failed to return, and that a second crew had found the men of the first dead in a ditch. When the signal officer learned that Hill had a line to Spa and thence to Eupen, he was elated and quickly put such a load on Hill's little switchboard that Hill had to ask him for operators to help. If the 99th Division was having communications problems, thought Hill, perhaps the 106th Division was too. When that proved to be the case, Hill immediately handled a call from General Jones to General Middleton. As it turned out, lines from the two divisions to their respective corps headquarters were in and out throughout the day, but by 7 o'clock that evening, both were in again, and Hill let the 99th Division's operators go. It was late in the evening when the 106th Division's line to the 8th Corps at Bastogne went out once more, and a call came through Hill's switchboard for Monarch 6. Hill connected it and listened in. It was General Jones, talking in riddles in case the Germans were tapping the line about his regiments on the Schnee-Eifel. He thought it would be wise to withdraw his two keys from where they are because they are very lonely. He knew, Jones continued, that he would have two big friends to rescue them in the morning, but he thought it would be wise to prevent a scissors working on them. Middleton responded that Jones was the commander on the ground. "You know how things are up there better than I do," he said. At that moment, a call came into the switchboard from the 99th Division. Since the departing operators had taken their telephones with them, leaving Hill with only one, he disconnected Jones and Middleton momentarily to tell the caller he would get back to him when the line was free, but he quickly reconnected Jones and Middleton. That brief period, only seconds, may have been the time when Middleton added, "But I agree it would be wise to withdraw them." When Jones put down the telephone, he was convinced either that Middleton wanted him to leave his regiments in place, or that he was putting the onus of the decision entirely on him. "Well, that's it," he said to one of his staff. "Middleton says we should leave them in." A short while later, that decision appeared to be confirmed when Jones saw an order from Middleton issued earlier in the day, but just arrived directing no withdrawals unless positions became totally untenable, and designating a line not far behind the existing front that was to be held at all costs. Jones apparently failed to note that that line in his sector was the west bank of the Our River, well behind the Schnee-Eifel. Meanwhile at Bastogne, when General Middleton put down his phone, he turned to a member of his staff. "I just talked to Jones," he said. "I told him to pull his regiments off the Schnee-Eifel." That night, the 106th Division's G2, Colonel Stout, noted in his periodic report, "The enemy is capable of pinching off the Schnee-Eifel area at any time."